Earlier today, I'd sort of reserved the day to just feel a little bit anxious, even though I feel like I do talk a lot more often now. I just know the process, so it's like the whole day was basically just set aside. And I remember one of the things that I put on my list was I was going to go for a long walk today. I feel like just getting out of the hotel, just start walking, which ended up being like a 6-hour walk, was to go see a project that had huge, I would say, inspiration in my academic career and then as an architect. It was done by Peter Sassenroth, and it was the Church of Reconciliation, not too far from here. And so I went and spent some time meandering around and found this wonderful woman who was looking after the building and was telling me a little bit more about it, and so that was wonderful. After I got back to the hotel, I was still feeling a little buzzed, so I remembered what my son said to me a few weeks ago after I picked him up from school, unprompted. Like, all I did was pick him up, and he was like, "Dad, you're a real one." And that was it. And I was like, thank you. No one ever says that. So I'll start this off from the beginning. And the beginning is long before me. And so in the late 1950s, my family, starting with my great uncle, emigrated from India to Canada. Not long after, my grandfather on my mother's side joined, and the way that it happened back then was they actually left alone, and their spouse and children were left back until they were able to save enough money to bring them. And in the case of my grandfather, that was about 4 years or so until my mother came. This is actually a little shop that my family on my father's side owned in Gujarat. That was essentially like a little electronics shop, although when I went to go see it in 2015, and it was still there, and just shortly after they ended up kind of disbanding this little building, it became very clear to me that this was actually just a place for the guys to hang out during the day, and it felt like the main event of the day was someone coming with tea out of nowhere with a big platter and giving it to the guys who were just sort of hanging out. In the early 1960s, my grandmother, my mother on the left, and my uncle finally came to Canada to meet my grandfather and eventually set up in Montreal. And so they were actually the first in the city, and really the first or second to come to Canada, while others had gone to England, such as my father's family. And so there was this really interesting transition period where my grandfather's home ended up becoming kind of the hub for everyone that came shortly after in that decade. And so this is a photo of my parents' wedding, my grandfather sitting next to my mom in their house. In the next photo, this is actually in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And I look at this photo as sort of being like kind of the close of a certain chapter. This was entire family on my father's side had finally come to Canada, one after the other. And I remember as a kid always going to the airport, what seemed like, every few weeks. And it was like tears, and you were kind of pressed up against the glass, and someone else had finally come over. Enough money was raised in the family that now his other uncle could come and his other cousin could come. And then by the 1970s and early 80s, most of that core family was there. And so this photo was actually taken at a really kind of special moment when my great-grandmother came to Toronto with my father's family. And it was, obviously very special to have everyone together. And that's me in her lap. And so one of the things I kind of look back on, and I'd have to admit that I wasn't really paying attention as a kid because, I, of course, had Indian, I come from an Indian family and was a part of this transition, but I was also a Canadian kid, and so I was doing my own thing as well. And so this photo is sort of how I remember being really little. It was always these big parties with people just crammed into the house, whatever house it was, whether it was one grandparent or the other, or eventually our own, and everybody just sitting on the floor. And so there was this sort of period where old traditions were sort of meeting new spaces. And so those small houses that we all lived in with multiple families over the course of the next, decade or two ended up becoming kind of larger houses, and people weren't sitting on the floor anymore. In front of our eyes, some of those things that we brought along with us were sort of starting to change. And like I was saying, I wasn't paying attention to any of this as a kid. This was like long after when I started to really thinking about space and culture and people that I look back. But at the time, my eyes were completely focused on what all my buddies at school were looking at, including the Blue Jays winning the World Series in 1993. And so at some point, my parents may have had an inkling that there was a little bit of talent in terms of drawing or in the arts. And so my father was really excited about this. Like, my parents were not from the arts. My mom was a nurse. My father was a lab technician in microbiology. And he had a real interest in the arts when he was growing up in school, but it just wasn't really kind of feasible. He ended up just sort of going down the road of science. And so when he saw that little bit of interest in me, he was really, really encouraging. And again, I'm kind of half in this and half not, because I'm just a kid and I'm not thinking about careers, I'm not thinking about any of that. Of course, I love to draw. And so I ended up going to this really wonderful school outside of the suburbs by about 20, 25 minutes or so, and it was actually known for the arts. And so it was a regular high school, and people came from like an hour or two away because it was in rural farmland. But there was a portion of the school that was specific to the arts, whether it was music or dance or drama or the visual arts. This was where you kind of spent most of your time focusing. And so that was like a real turning point for me, because all of a sudden, all of this energy was going into learning art history and architectural history and really kind of honing skills in terms of drawing and photography and all of these other mediums, which was really special to be surrounded by that kind of energy. And so in between high school and university, I worked at this little place along with all of my friends in order to pay for university. And so I worked in trucking. One of my friends' father owned a trucking company, and so we all spent the summers essentially loading trucks and sweating. And I thought, oh, this is like, there's something about this that kind of like screams chiaroscuro to me. And so I was able to bring a camera one day and not get it broken, and actually took some photos inside. And then they ended up hiring me to take kind of staff photos. And all these little, like, not serious things, I think started to build maybe a little bit of confidence in the arts. After high school, I got into the University of Toronto and studied there for a few years, and then decided to leave kind of the homestead in Toronto and moved out to the east coast of Canada. Now, to my family, I may as well have moved directly into the ocean at that point, because it was so far from kind of the major hub of Canada. But I ended up going because I had heard some amazing things about this little school there in the city. And again, I think there's Peter Sassenroth actually right there. It was amazing because, whether on purpose or kind of completely accidental, it was a place that was sort of like beautifully behind the times in a way, where technology hadn't fully taken over. We were building things with our hands. We were holding wood and learning how to nail into that lumber and actually build things. And I was just like completely absorbed with the people around me, because people came from different backgrounds, some in construction, some in the arts, some completely with other backgrounds altogether. And so we were all just really learning from each other and drawing by hand. And so, like, to me, with the background that I had, it was like, okay, this is amazing. And of course, in the years after school, it was a bit of a jump to learn kind of the technology side of it. But I think the sort of consequence of learning those primary skills that were so integral to academic architecture not too long before that, it was a real gift. Around that time as well, although, I would say that it was a bit of an upswing in terms of my experience in school and probably also the results I was getting, I ended up sort of being completely absorbed in the idea of leadership. The idea that you could change things basically by doing it yourself and gathering people around you. And essentially, this was a series of photos that I ended up taking of this little tree house that we did for the Boys and Girls Club in Nova Scotia. And that ended up becoming kind of a real pivotal moment for me because I just thought there's so much energy in gathering like-minded people together and actually kind of forging ahead for a good cause. Around that time when I was at Dalhousie was my first trip to India. So, I'm in my early 20s at this point, and I was very fortunate to go with my parents, my sisters, and all 4 of my grandparents to visit for the first time. And it was actually, I think, only the second time my father had gone, and this was him sitting in front of the house that he was born in. So it was a really sort of emotional experience for all of us, but for me, as someone who was really kind of deep into learning about people and culture and spaces and meaning, there was a real interest there for me, especially because it was learning about myself. After school, I ended up working for a variety of firms in Toronto and in Halifax of different scales. That was sort of planned and sort of accidental, and maybe like rooted by kind of some sort of anxiety as well. I was sort of jumping around. But I got to work on large commercial buildings. I got to work on small residential buildings. But one of the things I think that was really key for me was actually working at a large firm in a small department that was essentially kind of led by a series of draftsmen, people that just worked on these small houses and were drawing by hand for the most part. And from them, it was sort of like a continuation of university a little bit, but almost going a little bit deeper because I was really learning the nuts and bolts of drawing and construction detailing. Of course, with an arts background, I gathered some of that in school, but it was really then when they were like, okay, Omar, you're doing this, and we're drawing this wall section, and by the way, the contractor's gonna call you. And I remember at that time just thinking, like, I'm gonna throw up. Like, every day was just, on pins and needles, because all of a sudden, you're forced to learn in that sort of old school, sort of thrown in the pit kind of way, but it was so meaningful to learn that way, and to be on site, and to actually instruct, and to look at and listen to, I think, all of the kind of background and knowledge that people who had been on site for years had really provided. And so it was kind of like back and forth a little bit, but I would say primarily I was learning from everyone around me. So I ended up in 2010 being without a job. And so I lost my job. I didn't know where I was going to go or what I was going to do. I certainly had not considered the idea of running my own practice. I think it was in there somewhere in terms of the dreams, but I hadn't got to that point yet. I was sitting in my attic, and I essentially spent, I would say, a good week or two just imagining, just dreaming what I would do if I had an office. What did I love about the profession? What did I absolutely loathe about it? And if I did have a practice one day, how would I shape it? Well, let me tell you that feeling and those thoughts and those ideas stuck with me, for better or worse sometimes, because I'm very tough on myself, and I think about it all the time. The first project I got, and this shouldn't really count as showing work that we did, I had to keep busy. And so I ended up looking in the phone book and found that there was a technologist, this engineer who actually run a drafting company. And I'm pretty sure he called it something like 123 drafting, just so that it would come up as the top of the list, which worked because I called. And he basically said, okay, Omar, I get people all the time calling me for bathroom renovations and kitchens and things like that. I just need you to draw it. There's no design here, I just need you to draw it. But I was really excited. So I took on the job. And sadly, it is not even this house, but actually that little deck there. that occupied my time for a good week or two. Well, luck had it that after a series of these things, and there's something to learn in all of these sort of projects, I ended up getting kind of a string of good luck. And so the first project was for some friends of ours who wanted a little addition on the back of their house. The second came from the builder of the first project, and that was actually a new build for a cottage, and I'm not allowed to show you pictures, so you'll have to imagine. And then the third actually came from a press piece of the first two projects. This was all like in a span of about a year, 2010 to maybe 2011 and a half, okay? And in that period of time, like, I was fully immersed. And also sort of thinking, like, I'm not really ready to run my own practice. That wasn't the plan, but now I'm on a little bit of a roll here, and I can't let this end. And so I ended up just living this. Like, more I think now than, or more than I do now, because now there's so many things to think about, but I was just immersed in these relationships that I was building with builders and just being on site probably way more often than they wanted, and basically building relationship with clients that, this was their dream. They saved money their whole life, and now they got to build this little place in the woods, and there was just something so special and sort of primary about all of that. And with the builders themselves, they were in large part very new at this as well, and so it was a very important thing for them at the same time. And so what it became was just this insane sort of series of people betting on themselves and thinking, this is the most important thing I've ever done, and this could be the last thing, but basically went all in. And so there was this kind of hurricane of activity between all of that really allowed me to finally start the practice. The first person I hired, and this is the first studio that I had after I left the attic, was Jeff Shaw. Now, Jeff is with me to this day, and he joined about 2 weeks after my son was born. And so he's basically been with me since the beginning of this whole thing. Together, we've essentially created this language, especially for the residential architecture that we've created. And together, we learned how to draw from the context that surrounded us. Things that I think, you might just drive by and not think about, but just like the richness of culture and landscapes. And so like this hip roof, or this gambrel roof that's deep set into the landscape here, became kind of the beginning point of one of our projects, Trowbridge, essentially cutting it in half and building it out of steel. Drawing from these cultural references like this of the Acadian people and these haystacks that they built in the landscape, these ended up becoming huge starting points for many of our projects. And this windbreak that you ended up seeing it sort of line all of these really sort of regular buildings, and all they were was just a windbreak. So the door didn't slam, it just provided a little bit of shelter from the rain and from the wind. But we just kind of drew all of that in, just so that we could tell stories about places and people that couldn't be anywhere on earth. And so we started to kind of really expand on that. Now, the thing with the two of us is we just have way too much fun. And that's, I think, my practice is now 13 people between the two offices. I would hope to think that people have as much fun as I do, and I know that the core of us certainly do. But we took those original ideas of adaptation, about taking these forms and materials and technologies and ideas that are rooted in the place, and how you could actually manipulate it to say something about our current time. This was the second studio, maybe about 2014, so only 4 years later, and was able to hire a few more people. And at that time, in the province of Nova Scotia, where Halifax is, we started to dot the entire landscape with our work. And so now was a time for me to think a little bit about Toronto, where my family, my parents, and everyone is, and thought, okay, might be the time now to open a Toronto studio. And so I called on a dear friend and someone who I'd remained friends with for many years. And Stephanie basically ended up opening the Toronto office with me. We have the same little space still, this little brick-lined, century-old building. And we've been able to do, I think, some really amazing things with our little team out of that practice. But what I remember about Stephanie back then was not only was she incredibly talented and, I think fairly soft-spoken, I could just feel or maybe sense a little bit of myself in her, someone who just needed kind of a runway to really kind of open up. And she's become, I would say, one of the most incredible leaders I've ever known. This is our current office in Halifax now, so we moved again, and essentially started taking on a series of projects within the community. So this was a building that just basically sat derelict for the last decade and a half, and basically gutted it, revamped it, and it ended up becoming the home for, at the time, 11 homeless men in the community. The third associate who I hired in about 2016 was Jordan Rice, and I always refer to him as, I think, like the capital A architect of our team that brought an immense amount of knowledge and experience to our team that I think had most of our experience at a certain type of scale and typology. And so with him, we've been able to really kind of tackle things about, I would say, community activation and about public building and accessibility and these topics. And so this was actually a news article when we were working on our Peggys Cove project, which was essentially taking what was, one of Canada's most famous landmarks and making it accessible. Now, people were really upset about this because there was that question of change, right? And we, I think, see in our cities and landscapes all the time where, unfortunately, that change is oftentimes kind of thoughtless or not very sensitive. And so we went through an entire process of consultation, and we assured these people that, this was going to be a change for the good. And, the aim would be that the project itself would become a catalyst for accessibility in the country. Now, this is maybe the only project-related image I have here, but it was too good to not have there. And so in that period that passed, this lookout and boardwalk that points towards this, really well-known landmark and the crashing waves, it ends up becoming kind of this chapter, I think, in accessibility that's really been pushing the dialogue on that ahead. In the middle of COVID, we entered a competition for the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, and it was our intent that this project we would do differently. We put together a really special team led by KPMB architects and TransSolar, but at the core of this was an Indigenous-inspired team where we would actually get together, and this was sort of the tail end of COVID where we all got together on our office. And it was just a period about listening. And so for that day and for the weeks that followed, it was about listening. And so integral to the design of this art gallery and our proposal for the, in the competition, those ideas were rooted in there. And so we were taking this Colonial Grid in the city of Halifax and actually proposing to integrate something that was I think, rooted in ideas that were very different from what would be the norm. And so that was going to come with a lot of kind of contentious, I think there was a lot of pushback on that. But together, I think on a project like that, it ended up just making us really strong. And we really, really believed in what we were pushing for. This photo means a lot to me because this kind of exemplifies my studio and I think some of those ideas that I thought about right from the get-go. This was in the eve of the submission for that competition. And it was our job essentially to just kind of wrap things up. And so, we're all back from COVID, and we're all in this space together, and every single person in the office had their hands on this model to try and get it wrapped up. And the thing to know about this image is that not only were the architects working on it, the administrators were working on it, the finance people were working on it, we brought in family to work on it. Like, ultimately, this is just a snapshot of a larger room, but everybody poured their heart and soul into something that we believed really, really deeply in. And so, second to the last image, this is just an image of my team. I think a lot about that day and that period of time when I, ultimately was starting my own practice and didn't know it. And I think a lot about those values. We have a really, really tight-knit core. And we've stayed small on purpose so that we can be quite selective about the projects we take on, the things that are meaningful to us. But I am certainly grateful for this team. It was also really different to put together a proposal to put together a lecture when I couldn't actually show images of projects. I felt quite bare, and I didn't actually realize how much those images actually, I think, reinforce or provide some kind of identity as architects. And so it was a wonderful exercise. Now, finally, just this last image, I want to say that Stephanie and I have undertaken essentially a project where, at least in Canada, I don't know what it's like here in Germany, but we have a very bad condition where we don't support people with young families, especially women, and they're forced to make these really difficult decisions. And so a few years ago, we put into place a top-up program that would essentially cover and support people who take leave during that period, which would then ultimately allow them to breathe a little easier and ultimately stay in the profession. And so we're trying to talk to as many of our colleagues as possible and encouraging our peers, people who haven't got to that point in their life yet, or even people who've long passed it, to talk about it openly so that it becomes kind of normal place that it's something that we attack and we can better support people. Thank you guys very much.
You make it sound so easy to you were in your attic, you say, and then you went to work for a couple of weeks to that place, 1, 2, 3 drawings, and then it has developed to a very I would say distinguished office and with great projects, lots of them in Canada, of course, and working globally. What do you think? It is so challenging sometimes to make a passion and a hobby and something that we love into a sustainable business.
Yeah.
Because kind of even many of the ones that are working for someone are dreaming about that thing, but of course it was so easy during the presentation, but it's not that easy.
No. I talk a lot about balance in our profession and the fact that I certainly haven't experienced any of that. I don't have a very balanced life. And I think maybe because of the way that I was sort of entered into that scenario where I had to decide what I was going to do, there was a little bit of anger, I think, in there as well. I thought, I think I can do this. And what I ended up realizing was the actual design part and the creative outlet was maybe the easiest part. Yeah. The part that is the hardest, and I think maybe not for everyone, but certainly for me, was sticking to values, right? I mean, I think it's very easy once you start your own practice or your own business to kind of lose track of those things because of internal stresses and, whatever's going on in life. But, aside from, I'm very proud of where we've kind of come to as a practice in the last 15 years, but that's nothing in comparison to how proud I am that we're exactly the firm I wanted to be. So in that photo of my staff, in 15 years, I haven't lost a single staff member to another practice in the same city. Of course, there have been a few people that have gone to start their own practice, which we've supported. A few people have moved and whatnot. But not a single person is left because they went and thought about working for another firm in our city.
What do you think that happened?
I'm hoping, and I think it's because they're happy and they feel fulfilled and they feel like they're valued. You know, all these small things you think about and you witness, especially I noticed in that period after school when you start working somewhere, but then also you're surrounded by your peers that are working in all these other places. It's like, you know, why does it have to be like this? Like, why? You know, the two, and Wibke mentioned, you know, how these things can be run in parallel, be sustainable, be kind of enriched, but then also you can be kind of an award-winning practice that, you know, is very rigorous about work. I mean, we work generally like a 9 to 6 day. We don't really work overtime.
So it must be like that. It has to be like that. But I was asking more regarding establishing your own practices. Like, why do you think it's sometimes so difficult to put a certain office that works properly as a business in architecture?
The business part is the most terrifying, right? And I think that doesn't seem to go away, you know? Like, even if you grow a little bit, I've always been like very careful about hiring because, you know, that new number you have now is the thing that you need to support. So I've been very conservative in terms of that sort of stuff. But, you know, I don't know. I don't know what the magic is. All I know is that I don't take it for granted. And I think we operate in a way where those highs, you know, maybe someone told me this when I was younger. Actually, I think my grandfather said this. I remember, like, very clearly. I don't know why I lied there. He always commented that when little kids were running around and they were like screaming their head off, laughing or whatever, that right after that was going to be tears, right? It's just like, you know, you go like this and that, right? So I think we've always tried to operate without riding the wave. You know, whether people are paying attention to us or not, I think we're doing the best work that we can. And I don't think, if you take those highs too seriously, you know, and you're like, you know, cherishing your awards and that kind of stuff, it's also going to hit you just as hard when you're down here. And so why is it work for some firms and why doesn't it? I don't know. I feel very lucky though.
I imagine that. Maybe if we can get brief replies to 2 questions.
Sure.
Let's try it. Because you have mentioned that 10 years after establishing your practice, you decided no more awards. You will not apply for awards anymore.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, after a period of, you know, 5 or 6 years, we didn't apply for anything, and starting to do it again only because we're, you know, vying for more international work. And unfortunately, a lot of RFPs and things actually ask for that kind of information. But, you know, I'm just surrounded by people who don't care at all. The other day, we got something in the mail, and I unboxed it, and I was like, Jeff, look at this. Like, we did this together. And he didn't even want to touch it. Like, it was like, it was an award. Uh-huh. And he didn't care. And I just thought in that moment, those things have had such a profound impact on me, to surround yourself with people who are even better versions of yourself. And I rely on that, I think, immensely. That to me kind of summed up him and why I can be kind of balanced, because I'm surrounded by people who are just kind of focused on the work.
That's good. I mean, we see lots of practices trying to go into awards, expending a lot of money to have that label that will mean something to someone on LinkedIn. I don't know, but other people will say, this is like means nothing. So I don't know. There's a kind of a business behind it. Also at the same time, that will be a long conversation. But last question. You say that it's hard to to find a balance between like when you find a recipe for that what it works for good architecture, but at the same time, the balance between that and the temptation to stick to it because you know it worked and
Right.
you want to be creative. So I wonder, how do you balance that fear of still being creative and do something new, even if that's something that is far away from that what worked very well in the past?
Yeah, well, I think, again, I think it's personalities. I think, Jeff and I and Jordan and I and Stephanie and I and our team, maybe it's kind of comes rooted from me a little bit in that case. I get bored so easily that I can't imagine wanting to duplicate things. Like the whole fun of the process is the process itself, right? And so, I think someone was asking the other day about, what does it take in terms of the clients that you take on? And I would say, without hesitation, the thing that we look for in a client is their comfort with the unknown, right? Like, of course people send, Pinterest boards and that sort of thing, but, someone who understands that we're going to get somewhere really special together, but we need to go through this process. Like, that's why you get into architecture.
That's actually nice.
Yeah.
We like the unknown too. Omar, thank you for the talk. Thank you for the conversation. Now, we are going to start the round of discussion in a minute, but you can take a seat and receive the warm.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. An applause from the audience. Thank you.